former President Donald Trump will be the 47th president of the United States.
It's time to put the divisions of the past 4 years behind us. It's time to unite.
Vice President Kamala Harris conceded the election on Wednesday.
Do not despair. This is not a time to throw up our hands. This is a time to roll up our sleeves.
Trump also recaptured Georgia's 16 electoral votes.
Well, tonight, Georgia Republicans are united in total victory.
It was a dramatic reversal from Democrats' surprise triumph 4 years ago in Georgia.
I think it's going to take a while for folks to understand exactly what it is that we're fighting against. Losing our democracy, it's everything. And I don't think a lot of folks realize how devastating it's going to be if that happens.
And despite dozens of bomb threats at polling places across the state, election officials say the election went smoothly. More than 5.2 million Georgians cast a ballot.
Thank you to all the Georgians who did their duty to vote in the safest, most secure election in our nation's history. Millions of voters showed up to vote, and you voted in record numbers.
On today's episode, how Trump won Georgia. I'm WABE Politics reporter Rahul Bali.
I'm WABE Politics reporter Sam Gringlas, and this is Plugged In, a WABE Politics podcast.
All right, Sam, let's start with Trump's stunning return to the White House and how Georgia played a role in delivering his win.
Yeah, Rahul, you were at the Georgia GOP's watch party. Talk about what the mood was like in the room at that moment when Georgia went back into the GOP column.
So, Sam, we were in the Grand Ballroom at the Grand Hyatt Hotel. Fox News was playing on the two big screens. And as states were called for former President Trump and other Republicans won races across the country, there were cheers. Then came Georgia's moment, delivered to the crowd by Georgia GOP Chair Josh McCoon.
Has officially called the state of Georgia for Donald Trump.
Now look, Sam, the Georgia GOP still has its challenges, but Trump retaking Georgia, no changes to the state's congressional or state Senate balance, and a minimal loss in the state house, I think this allows Georgia Republicans to turn their focus to 2026.
And our colleague Brendan Rivers was at the Georgia Democrats party where it was an early night. Most supporters filed out of the hotel ballroom by 11. At the beginning of the show, we heard from Marcella Campbell from Snellville. She spoke to Brendan, and you could just hear the worry in her voice. We're already hearing there's going to be some soul searching among Georgia Democrats as they prepare to push back on a second Trump administration and also gear up for the 2026 election when Senator Jon Ossoff is up for re-election and the governor's race is wide open. Now, on election night, I was at Fulton County election headquarters where things went pretty smoothly. Most results were in by 11 p.m. And, there were some brief disruptions throughout the day caused by bomb threats around the state. Investigators determined them to be non-credible and the work of Russians intent on stoking divisions in the U.S. But really, Rahul, across the state, there were no reports of major issues. Despite a lot of worry, this election went pretty smoothly. So let's talk more about those top-line results of the election. Rahul, what exactly unfolded?
So you had more than 5.2 million Georgians cast a ballot. That comes out to a turnout of about 63% of registered voters, 72% if you take out all the inactive voters. Trump, at last check, was leading Vice President Kamala Harris by nearly 115,000 votes, about 2.2%. Remember, the margin in 2020 was under 12,000. Still a close race compared to 2016, but not as tight as the last go-around. One other question that I got, Sam, was what about the third-party candidates? And their numbers did not figure into the margins. Libertarian Chase Oliver and the Green Party's Jill Stein, if you put that all together, that margin was 39,000 votes.
Okay, I want to talk about some of the places that powered Trump's win here in Georgia. Harris did improve on President Joe Biden's 2020 margin in some metro Atlanta counties like Douglas, Fayette, Henry, Rockdale, but it was not enough to counteract the overarching shift to the right across much of the state and also across much of the country. If you look at that shift from 2020 map the New York Times has, it's really worth looking at, and you just see a country blanketed in red arrows with just a couple little blue ones. Even here in Georgia, in cobalt blue Clayton, DeKalb, Fulton, and Gwinnett counties, Trump actually improved his margin over 4 years ago. And he also juiced more votes out of those smaller barn red counties that have always been the base of his support. Now, in Cobb County and Cherokee County, Democrats expected to make more inroads with suburban independents and disaffected Republicans, especially on these issues like abortion and democracy. But in the end, Democrats only gained really marginal ground over 2020 in these important counties. Rahul, we've been talking about some of the places that determine this election. I wonder, when you look at the exit polls and AP Votecast, what did they suggest about what kind of voters powered this shift to the right across the state?
Look, Sam, there are so many networks, so many exit polls. The one I wanted to share was the one you just mentioned from our partners at the Associated Press. They interviewed 115,000 people over an 8-day period. Let me say that number again, 115,000 people. And here's what they found. About 40% of young voters, and those are voters under the age of 30, went for Trump. That's up from 1/3 in 2020. Also, the AP noted a shift among Black and Latino voters who appear to support Harris slightly less than Biden 4 years ago. 8 in 10 Black voters backed Harris, while it was 9 out of 10 for Biden in 2020. More than half of Hispanic voters supported Harris. But then again, that was down slightly from the 6 out of 10 that backed Biden in 2020. So Trump's support among those groups appeared to rise slightly compared to 2020.
But again, this election saw shifts to the right across many places and demographics. According to the New York Times, more than 90% of counties shifted toward Trump compared to 2020.
Now, over on issues, the top issue among Georgia voters, far and away, 44%, was the economy. Now, we did a lot of reporting. A lot of people told me about abortion, but in the end, that was the top issue for only 10% of voters. And then the issue of immigration. Not as much that the percentage of people who mentioned that as a top issue, but the intensity, that it was so much more of a bigger issue than it was 4 years ago. Now, Sam, let me take you back to the Grand Hyatt Hotel. It was not just the home of the GOP's election night party, but it was their home of their election day war room. And one of the people in that room, Georgia's GOP chair, Josh McCoon. I chatted with him after the party had wrapped up, and here are his thoughts on Trump's victory in Georgia.
So I think it was a combination of being able to bring in low propensity voters. I think when we look back at this election, probably about 1 million, 1 in 5 voters did not vote in 2020. I think those voters broke for President Trump in big numbers. I think the other big story here is just the failure to excite Black turnout by Vice President Harris, particularly Black male voters. And I think finally you saw this really huge turnout in rural Georgia and the exurbs, and particularly in the early voting, which made it much easier for us down the stretch because our universe got so much smaller of who we needed to turn out today.
Now, look, McCoon is coming from his own point of view, but from what I saw on the campaign trail, Black voters, both men and women, were absolutely excited about Harris, especially when she became the presidential nominee. And the numbers that we mentioned earlier bear that out. As for the numbers that McCoon mentioned about early voting, President-elect Donald Trump had 2 million early in-person and absentee votes versus 1.98 million for Vice President Harris. So going into Election Day, Trump had a lead.
Okay, so we've been talking about this in data in terms of shifts, in terms of exit polls, but I want to revisit a couple of conversations with voters I met during the campaign that I've been thinking about kind of in a new light as we begin to look under the hood of these election results. So we've been talking about this shift among some Latinos toward Trump, driven in part by the economy. And that made me think of the conversation I had with Daniela Userin outside a Trump rally in Atlanta. She immigrated from Uruguay 54 years ago and is also retired.
Prices of food and gas, they're just getting way too high. I'm retired. I'm glad that I have a pension in addition to the Social Security. Otherwise, I couldn't make it.
All right, so over the last several years, we've been talking about the extent to which abortion is shaping elections since the overturn of Roe v. Wade. As we just heard from the AP Votecast data, only 10% of Georgia voters said that was the most important issue shaping their vote. And over the course of this campaign, I've met a lot of voters who say that they are pro-abortion rights, who say abortion rights are important to them, but for many, it might not be the driving force that some Democrats hoped it would be. On the Alpharetta Town Green a couple of weeks ago, I met Emily Lillystone and Shauna Goles. We heard from them on the podcast last week. And while Goles thought that Trump is morally awful, she says she still voted for him after voting for Biden in 2020. And this is something that we're seeing borne out in the numbers, where Harris's expected gains in the suburbs and exurbs among these independent voters really didn't materialize in the way that they hoped it would. Lillystone talks first. She voted for Harris. Then you'll hear Goles, who went with Trump.
I don't think as a woman I want the government involved in what I'm deciding to do with my body, and nor do I want that for my daughters.
I completely agree with everything Emily said. However, I feel like my safety walking down the street to get a soda is more important than whether or not my daughter can have an abortion.
Now, finally, Rahul, you were talking about Trump's growing strength with young men. And that made me think of the conversation I had with Jackson Anderson, a first-time voter who's in trade school for construction management. And he told me he was very excited to cast his first vote for Trump.
I know he's a fighter. I mean, as we saw, July 13th, he got shot and he raised his fist in the air and said, fight, fight, fight. I know he cares about this country and he doesn't give up.
And again, that plays on some of the hyper-masculine messaging that we've heard from the Trump campaign, and that has attracted a lot of these younger male voters.
Trump hats here. So, Sam, I want to do something similar. I want to share a conversation that I had with two Trump supporters that I met at Trump's final campaign rally in Georgia in Macon.
Oh, we're going to do it together.
We'll do it together.
We can do it together. Sure.
Veronica Skinner is an immigrant from Mexico who lives in Gray. That's a city that's between Macon and Milledgeville. And Bridget Wright, a black woman from Milledgeville, who starts our conversation.
We're tired of what's going on at the border. We're tired of the inflation. We're tired of all the people coming across the border not vetted. And they get more rights than we do. Think about our veterans that's living on the street. Think of the homeless people living on the street. And they're not getting what these people are getting. Mm-hmm. And we don't have anything against immigrants coming over. You know, like my sister here is an immigrant. We don't have anything, but you got to be vetted. You got to come over the right way. And we got to be America first.
Yes, girl. That's just it. Yes, I joined the service at 18, and I got my citizenship years after that. I owe a lot to the United States, and I'm very appreciative of it. I still have family that lives in the border, and I have people that I graduated with that talk about the problems of the border. And it's not about being racist to anybody. It's about not treating our people come first.
To me, that short conversation is so insightful for what brought some folks to the Trump camp.
Let's take a break here. This is Plugged In, a WABE Politics podcast. Welcome back to Plugged In, a WABE Politics podcast. So we've been talking about the presidential race, but this was not the only thing on Georgians' ballots. Rahul, I want to have you recap what happened with all of those ballot measures that we've been talking about on the podcast.
So, Sam, all three of them passed. Let's quickly go through them. The Constitutional Amendment 1 caps the increase of home property values to the rate of inflation starting next year. Now, if local governments need more revenues to balance their budgets, they're going to have to look at raising the actual property tax rate, consider a new sales tax. They also have the option of opting out, which can be done, which includes public hearings and then an actual vote. Constitutional Amendment number 2 creates a statewide tax court specifically for the appeals of tax cases. This kicks in January 1st. By the way, the number one question that I got on this is, can someone still represent themselves in front of this court? Yes, you can still do that. And finally, the tax exemption for tangible personal property goes up from $7,500 to $20,000 starting next year. That's really about expenses for smaller businesses like computers and office supplies.
Okay, and how about those competitive state legislative races we've been watching?
So before I get into these, I should remind folks that the Georgia House and Georgia Senate were elected using new lines after a federal court ordered redistricting last year because the lines drawn in 2021 were ruled to have diluted black voting power. The Republican-led legislature obviously drew the lines to try to minimize their losses, and it seems that's what's happened in the state Senate. There is no shift. They'll remain with a strong Republican majority of 33 to 23. Over in the Georgia House, based on the latest numbers, it looks like the Democrats may only gain 2 seats. Republicans did lose 2 seats that they were not surprised about. State Representative Ken Vance down in the Milledgeville area, he had been drawn into a heavily Democratic district. And Misha Maynor, who had switched parties from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party, but she was still running in a heavily Democratic district. It looks like Democrats will pick up a seat in Middle Georgia that was created during redistricting, and Democrats are behind on a Gwinnett County seat held by State Representative Farouk Mughal. He's right now losing to Republican Sandy Donatucci.
Okay, so we've been talking about specific races, but what are some big picture takeaways?
So with the projected majority of 100 to 80, it means Republicans in the Georgia House still kind of have what I call a strong working majority. They can lose a couple of votes to something like a more conservative member who regularly votes no on principle, or members who may be just gone for their jobs or an illness. You see the power of redistricting. Back to that race with Farouk Mughal, Republicans shifted the district just enough to what looks like for him to lose because they just took a few conservative-leaning votes out of another Republican's district. And then finally, this is one of the things that I think is important to point out, the work of Governor Brian Kemp and his organization, something you did reporting on, Sam. It looks like the swing districts incumbents in the Atlanta area that he specifically campaigned for won, along with that one flip that we're talking about. Overall, Kemp's organization spent $2 million on GOP candidates. Bottom line, Kemp and House Speaker John Burns will have about the same amount of power to get things done on their agenda. And I should mention the 2025 Georgia General Assembly kicks off January 13th.
Before we go, let's talk about what happens next. The deadline for counties to certify their election results is next Tuesday. Then Georgia's Trump electors meet on December 17th, and Congress certifies the vote on January 6th. Exactly 4 years after the attack on the U.S. Capitol by Trump's supporters intended to disrupt the peaceful transfer of power to Biden amid Trump's false claims of widespread fraud. And I should note, with Trump sweeping the battleground states, all the talk about potential fraud by Trump and his allies, including in Georgia, has come to a halt.
And that's it for this election week edition of Plugged In, a WABE Politics podcast. Our producer is Brendan Rivers. Our managing editor is Alex Helmick.
A special thanks to editors Molly Samuel, Patrick Saunders, and Rebecca Etter, as well as our photographer Matt Pearson and so many other members of the WABE newsroom who've been instrumental in providing coverage of the 2024 election.
And Sam, I also want to thank all the amazing members of the WABE newsroom and staff. We'll still be here next week and continuing to bring you the facts, context, and voices you rely on.